Hello. Welcome. And thank you for coming on this actual spring day in Chicago, the kind of thing we've been waiting and waiting for. We just needed you to talk. My name is Candace Vogler. I'm a professor in the Department of Philosophy here at the University of Chicago and a principal investigator on the John Templeton Foundation grant, Virtue, Happiness, and the Meaning of Life. My other principal investigator is at the University of South Carolina, Professor Jennifer Frey. We are delighted to have you here. Professor Stephen Brock is the visiting scholar this term for the John Templeton Foundation grant. And when he's not getting ready to give us a talk, he's busy leading a lot of us through a wonderful reading of Aquinas' commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics, and also leading a faculty and doctoral student reading group on free choice, which is the topic of his manuscript, I take it. He has written wonderful books. He has written amazing articles. He is actually my favorite living Aquinas scholar. So getting to share a department with him this term has just been fantastic for me. He's going to be talking to us about Aquinas and the life of the mind, and our talk is co-sponsored by the University of Chicago Divinity School, the Department of Philosophy, the Martin Marty Center, and the Lumen Christi Institute, and his visit in general is also supported by the Hyde Park Institute. Please join me in welcoming Professor Stephen Brock.
Well, thank you very much, Candace, for that very kind introduction. And thank you, everyone, for coming. Well, this talk is about Thomas Aquinas, and I would like to begin with some words about him from a philosopher who is very dear to Professor Vogler. The philosopher's name also graces the room in the philosophy department where the reception after the talk will take place. That's Elizabeth Anscombe. The words are actually from an indirect quotation of her that her daughter, Mary Geach, published a few years ago. Anscombe, Mary writes, quote, said to me that it aroused prejudice in people to tell them that a thought came from him, from Aquinas. She said that to ascribe a thought to him made people boringly ignore the interest of it, whether they were for Aquinas or against him, in either side. Now, I dare say Anscombe herself was rather for Aquinas, and she was anything but boring, you know. But I've seen the kind of reaction that she describes, and I think it's kind of sad that the mention of Aquinas' name could stifle thinking in that way. He was such a lover of the life of the mind, and so devoted to helping others live it too. I'm told that the Archbishop of Vienna, Cardinal Schönborn, once went so far as to say that Aquinas was the only man ever canonized simply for thinking. Actually, there may be some truth in that, you know, because at his canonization, only one thing was cited officially as a miraculous work of his, and that was the Summa Theologiae. Now, that might be just the sort of thing that could sort of fuel prejudices, I suppose, for or against. But isn't there something interesting about the idea of being canonized for thinking? It would mean that there is such a thing as holy thinking, thinking in the service of God, for the love of God. Now, I admit that expression, holy thinking, might sound like dogmatic thinking, and that might, to some people, sound boring. It might sound like narrow thinking. And it is true, Thomas is dogmatic about some dogmas. But to his mind, those dogmas are far from either boring or narrow because they encapsulate the teaching of the very liveliest and broadest mind of all. Moreover, for Aquinas, not all things are directly matters of dogma. In particular, philosophy is not. Philosophy, he insists, has its own principles, and they are not dogmas. And he philosophized a lot. That was part of his holy thinking. Of course, St. Thomas did not want simply to think, he wanted to know. A university professor himself, he could have fully endorsed this university's motto, let knowledge grow from more to more, and so be human life enriched. And Thomas even thought that he did know some things. Or maybe better, that he knew something about some things. Two things that he thought he knew something about are the ones in my title, life and mind. So let me briefly sketch his notions of these two things. I'll start with mind. For Aquinas, the word mind, in Latin, mens, refers first of all to what he regards as the highest power of the human soul, the power of understanding, or intellect. In his view, I would say, two features of the intellect especially stand out. One is captured in a phrase of Aristotle's that Thomas cites very often. In a way, all things. The intellect is something huge, in a sense even infinite. Not in size, of course, but in capacity. It can extend to whatever is, to all beings. It does so not by going out to them, but by taking them in. Obviously, it does not take them in physically or materially, but it takes in their forms, which are their natures, making them be what they are. It's a kind of home for all things. In practice, of course, we never succeed in knowing them all, far from it. That's because we get them piecemeal by gradual experience and reasoning, and life is short. But the intellect itself is open to them all. That's the point. And it is open to itself, too. It can grasp its own nature and how it relates to the things it knows. In fact, what really gives it satisfaction is to know things as they are, and at the same time, to know itself, knowing them as they are. Or in other words, as Aristotle also says, the intellect's good is to know truth. This is the other feature of the intellect that stands out in Aquinas. It is our power to know truth. Obviously, he's aware that our intellect can err and think falsely, but it has some understanding of the difference between being true and being false, and it has valid criteria for distinguishing true thoughts from false ones. It is kind of a judge of its own works, a fallible one, but far from incompetent. Now, for reasons I can't really go into here, Thomas holds that these features of intellect, its openness to all things, and its knowing and judging truth, are a result of its being what he calls a spiritual power. That's not a reference to religion. It means that the intellect does not have a bodily organ. Thomas takes his favorite arguments for this thesis from Aristotle. To be sure, he also takes from Aristotle the view that our intellect always works together with another power, the imagination, which does have an organ, the brain. But in itself, he insists, intellect is spiritual. Moreover, on his view, intellect is not our only spiritual or incorporeal power. In fact, under the term mind, Thomas includes not only the intellect, but also what he calls voluntas, will. He sees the will as essentially dependent upon the intellect. its own essential definition refers to the intellect. The will is the intellectual appetite. But it's really different from the intellect. The difference is very simple. By the intellect, the mind takes things into itself, or at least their forms. As I said, it's a kind of home for things. And it works at home, so to speak, which is to say all of its knowing and its judging, its thinking, all of that remains in the mind itself. It's all spiritual. By the will, on the other hand, the mind tends toward things in themselves. It desires and clings to things. It's the mind's power to love. And while it is spiritual in itself, in loving and clinging to a thing, it adapts to the thing's condition, whatever that is. So the will is more at home with the thing, so to speak. So lovers of knowledge, they live the life of the mind. Lovers of trees, I guess, they live the life more of the forest, so to speak. Right? And lovers of television live the life of the couch potato. Sorry. So the idea is sort of where your treasure is, there your heart is also. The will goes to the thing that it loves. Of course, the will does not just seize on any old thing indiscriminately. It can tend only toward what the intellect judges fit to tend toward, which is to say desirable or lovable, or in a word, good. That's why the will is the intellectual appetite. It follows the intellect. But the intellect, by extending to everything, can register goodness wherever it is found, and the range is enormous. A thing is good, intrinsically good, Thomas finds, just insofar as it's perfect, which is to say complete or fulfilled. It has everything that its nature requires. The world contains many, many different kinds of things, and their fulfillments differ too, obviously. The fulfillment of a tree is not the fulfillment of a fish, for example. But every perfection is something that the intellect can grasp and can appreciate, and it can thereby engage the will. By our wills, we can love all good things. We can want them to exist and enjoy them. Naturally, we also love ourselves, and we want our own fulfillment, which includes the fulfillment of the will itself, and that too is something really huge. It means what leaves nothing to be desired, everything. And Thomas calls that happiness. That's what he calls happiness. So much for the mind. Let me say now a word or two about Aquinas' notion of life. What sets living beings apart from inanimate things, he judges, is that they are intrinsically active. In some way or another, they act on their own, from out of themselves. They're sort of self-activating, you can say. But they're not all so to the same degree. The lowest grade is the vegetative. Plants do promote their own activity. They work for their own survival, their growth, their propagation by taking in and processing nutrients and other things. Animals, however, activate themselves in a more radical way, he thinks. By their perceptions and their desires, they launch their own movements. They guide themselves in one direction or another. They navigate their surroundings. They initiate their own interactions with things and put a stop to them. But the animals that have minds, Thomas holds, live to an even higher degree. Why is it higher? Now here I think his reason may be surprising. When Thomas considers the mind's distinctive mode of life, he doesn't center on its power to take in all things or its power to know the truth. He doesn't focus just on intellect. He focuses on something that involves both intellect and will. He focuses on free choice. With our minds, we not only make ourselves move in one direction or another, interact with things in one way or another, as animals do, all animals, we also have an active role in adopting the very motives or reasons for which we move and act. That is, we decide our own goals, our own ends. We set our own priorities. We make choices. Choice, he says, is an act of the will. It's, so to speak, a two-pronged act. It consists in preferring one thing to another. It relates to both. You take one thing in, rejecting another. That's a choice. He says that presupposes an act of the intellect, grasping the two things together, putting them side by side, considering the reasons on both sides. That's the process called deliberation. A choice is a deliberate desire, and it is free. For although you have reasons for choosing as you do, the reasons are not absolutely compelling. You also see that there are, or at least might be, if you look further, reasons for the opposite choice. When you choose, for example, one career over another, you don't lose sight of the attractions of the other one. You see that you could choose that instead. Choices don't simply happen in us instinctively by some natural process, as feelings and emotions often do. Nor is a choice simply the victory of one urge over another. Somehow, that can also happen by a kind of natural process. A choice is a desire that one gives to oneself, he thinks, by a spiritual process, whose final outcome is neither predetermined nor simply random. Choices are things that we form. We ourselves, by reason and will, apply our wills and ourselves to one goal rather than another. A choice is like the answer to a question. Where shall I go? What shall I pursue? Only it's not an answer that one discovers. It's an answer that one makes. As Thomas puts it, he puts it this way: one determines oneself to willing this or that. So with free choice, beings with minds enjoy an especially high grade of self-activation and of life. They not only promote their own development, as plants do, and not only initiate and direct their external movements, as beasts do, but also shape the very desires from which their movements spring. They alone are truly in command of their movements, or to use Thomas's phrase, masters of their actions, domini sui actus. They are their own bosses. Obviously not totally. Our control is not total. It has limits and constraints, but it's genuine. Those with free choice are the protagonists in the scene, the principal actors, the dramatis personae on the stage of the world, each one with his or her own life story. In fact, Thomas cites just this fact of being in command of their actions and acting on their own responsibility as the reason why each and every intellectual individual, as such, possesses the worth, what he calls the great dignity, signified by the term person. But at this point, I'd like to try to inject a little bit of drama, if I can speak that way, into this little story. Because in the very place where Thomas argues for the mind's high grade of life on the basis of its power of free choice, he also says that the human mind is nevertheless determined to certain things, not by itself, but by another agent. Thus, there are first principles of understanding about which we cannot think otherwise. For instance, the truth that whole is greater than part, or the famous principle of non-contradiction. We can't think otherwise about those. And there's what he calls the last end, or the ultimate goal, which he says we cannot fail to want. About these things, the mind's actions are still spiritual, but they are also, in a very real sense, natural. They emerge spontaneously. The mind has no more control over them than it has over its being a mind and not something else. And some outside agent is what determines it to them. Of course, that outside agent for Thomas is God. Now, Thomas says these things in that place very matter-of-factly. But unless I'm very much mistaken, readers, modern readers anyway, are rather likely to find them a bit surprising or problematic, or maybe even downright absurd, I think. How can the same thing be both self-determining and determined by another, free and bound to uncontrollable processes, its own master, and subject to external dominion? Now, in fact, Thomas does in other places try to help us understand these claims, but his account of it only heightens the drama, I think, because he does not just argue that these claims entail no sheer absurdity. Right? In fact, he argues that these God-given natural determinations of the mind are the very origin of the mind's power to determine itself. That without them, our free choice would be quite impossible. Of course, I can't lay out his full treatment of this here, but I would at least like to show that, as Anscombe might say, it's not boring. First of all, I think we should consider what it means to be determined. This is interesting. The word does seem to suggest something like bound or restricted or limited. What is determined to one thing is thereby cut off from other things. Nevertheless, whether or not that really is a restriction depends on what the one thing is. Right? It may be a very big thing. Thomas has a very striking passage to illustrate this idea. He has a very striking passage in which he takes up a problem about God, about whether God's nature is knowable. The problem lies in the fact that God's nature is infinite, unlimited. A knowable object, Thomas says, is always determined. He uses that word, determined. The problem is precisely that this sounds like bound or limited. Okay? But then he distinguishes between two senses of the word determined. In one sense, it does mean limited or finite, and God's nature is not determined in that sense. But there's another sense, and in that sense, his nature is determined. It is distinct from every other nature. It is determined to be just that one nature, the Godhead, and not any other. Maybe in English, the word, what captures it better would be the word determinate, perhaps. God has his own identity, his own form. It's not in any way a restriction or a limitation. The divine nature contains in itself all possible perfection. That's the very sense in which it is infinite. It's because he is just what he is that God can be cause of all beings, insofar as they are beings. That's why he can create. And his infinity is not an obstacle to his knowability. On the contrary, he is also infinitely knowable. He is kind of a boundless reservoir of truth, so to speak. Now, I mention that because the things to which the human mind is naturally determined are in a way like that. They are knowable. They are distinct from other things, and in that sense, they're determinate. But they also have a kind of infinity. Of course, it's not God's infinity. A created mind cannot be a creator. But the most basic principles to which the intellect is naturally determined are truths that extend to absolutely all beings. They are the first step in the mind's becoming all things, guiding its subsequent moves. And similarly, the will's determination to want that which Thomas calls the last end is the root of its tendency toward anything at all. For the last end is in fact nothing other than the total good. It is just that whose attainment, happiness, leaves nothing at all to be desired. So let me focus on this particular thing, the will's natural desire for the total good. This is its most fundamental desire, Thomas thinks, and it is why the will can desire nothing that does not seem somehow good. It wills things, as they say, under the guise of the good. It cannot will the bad insofar as it's bad. And so there is a genuine determinacy here, in order toward the good, cutting off the bad, so to speak. But again, the good is something enormous. In fact, it's bigger than the human mind itself. Human nature, after all, is not infinite. It may be open to all reality, have an infinite openness, but in itself it is something finite. It's only part of reality. Every kind of creature, Thomas holds, contains in its own nature some perfection and goodness that no other kind contains. There are more or less perfect natures, and maybe the nature of persons is the most perfect, but each of the less perfect natures still has something that our nature does not have. And it's for this very reason that those natural determinations of the will and the intellect must be the work of an outside agent. They are quite natural to the mind. They flow somehow from its nature, but its nature does not suffice to account for them fully. It must be under the influence of an even higher and even more perfect nature. If an agent that directs one thing to another and moves the one in an efficacious way toward the other must have both of them in its grasp and in its power somehow. In other words, the natural determinations of the intellect and the will, they must originate in a God. That is, in a mind whose intellect is not merely open to all things, but actually contains them all, as their exemplar in their cause, and whose will already possesses all goodness. Moreover, although God is extrinsic to our mind, distinct from our mind, it would be incorrect to say that he imposes those determinations upon it. He causes them by causing the mind itself, by creating it in such a way that its natural powers and those natural determinations flow from it. God produces his effects in the mind and in all things from the inside, so to speak, not by an imposition. But what is more, for Thomas, those natural determinations of the mind are the very root of its free choice. Because the intellect grasps the good universally, and because the will tends toward the total good, the mind can determine itself with respect to any particular or partial good. It is not utterly bound to any one of them. In that case, the total good would be out of its range. Any partial good in itself is something that the will can take or leave. And as I said earlier, its choices are not mere sudden, unreflective urges. In making a choice, we draw upon our will's native impulse toward the total good, that natural determination, and apply its energy to the production of a new subordinate impulse, so to speak. We order and shape that impulse by using our own power to weigh things on the scale of the good. We deliberate and choose. Thomas sums the idea up this way. He says, God moves the will of the human being as a universal mover toward the will's universal object, which is the good. And without this universal motion, it's an interesting idea, isn't it? A universal motion. Without that, a human being cannot will anything. But the human being, through reason, determines himself to willing this or that. That's a choice. This or that, and Thomas continues, which is either truly good or at least an apparent good. Now, of course, these last words, a truly good or an apparent good, are kind of important. Sometimes what we affirm as true is false, right? And sometimes what we choose as good is, in fact, bad. It's not always one's own fault. Sometimes one could not have known better, but sometimes one could. For among the principles that we naturally understand are truths about the good and the bad. In relation to the last end, the bad is what thwarts the movement toward the end, what is out of order toward it. The naturally understood truths serve to discern between what is and what is not ordered to the end. But it is up to us to apply those truths. What lacks order to the end may nonetheless have something good about it, something that seems to fit the desire of the total good. And rather than stopping to examine it to see whether the fit is genuine, the will may simply go ahead and choose it for whatever does seem good about it. And then its badness is indeed one's own fault. Now, these naturally understood principles about good and bad constitute what Aquinas calls natural law. He describes natural law as a law that God has instilled in the mind so as to be known naturally. Whether or not we are aware of it, we are, for Thomas, by nature under God's governance and God's law. And it is a real law. It commands some things and forbids others. It sets boundaries. And so we can ask, I think, at least here, is there not a curtailment of our freedom after all? Part of the answer to that lies in what I just said, I think. It's true that the natural law comes from God, just as do the other natural determinations of the intellect and the will. But those determinations, as we saw, are very far from being restrictions. And natural law really is nothing but a guide to their full unfolding. It does not cut us off from the last end, from the total good. The things that cut us off from that are what it prohibits. It prohibits, so to speak, the dead ends. That's what it prohibits. And it leaves open a very broad path. Thomas insists that there are many ways to happiness. That is, many true ways of living a good, full life. Of course, they all have things in common. But the most essential thing is precisely to follow the promptings of our best part, the intellect. Or as he is fond of saying, to act according to reason. To do that well is what he calls to act virtuously. In a way, to be virtuous is nothing other than to be true to oneself, one's very best self. So I think we can say natural law is not, as Thomas conceives it anyway, a constraint on our pursuit of happiness. He goes so far as to say this in the Summa Contra Gentiles. He says, God is not offended by us except in what we do against our own good. He also spells out that idea in a more positive way. He says, God's primary aim in governing things is the good of the world as a whole, of course, the common good of the world. But that governance of God's is not uniform. God governs different things differently. Most notably, he governs rational creatures, those with minds, in a very special way. And that way is, as Thomas puts it, for their own sake. For their own sake. He governs each individual, each person in that way. What that means, Thomas explains, is that the goods to which God directs persons are not just for others to make use of eventually. That would be slavery. They are, first of all, for the persons themselves. This, Thomas says, is the way of being governed that befits free beings. Now, in saying that, he's drawing on what he takes as the best definition of freedom. Once again, it comes from Aristotle. The Latin version of it that Thomas uses of this definition is this. It's causa sui. Now, this expression can actually be taken in two ways, and Thomas uses them both deliberately. They're connected. One way is cause of one's own, causa sui, cause of one's own for the Latinists here. Now, that fits with the idea of free choice as a high grade of life and of self-activation. By free choice, we are really the causes of our own actions and even desires. The other way to take causa sui is with the word causa in the ablative case. And then it means precisely for one's own sake. And that's the deeper fundamental meaning for Thomas. If persons are endowed with free choice, it's because that is the way of acting that befits beings that exist and act and are governed for their own sake. Now, Thomas is also careful to say that created persons are not governed solely for their own sake. They too are ordered to the common good of the universe. But they are ordered to it in the way that suits beings that are their own masters and are for their own sake. They are meant to share in the very responsibility for the common good and also in the enjoyment of it. At least in a good regime, and Thomas does think that God's regime is a good one, one who fulfills the law and thereby promotes the common good deserves to participate in its achievement. The well-being of the community is for each of the community-minded members to enjoy. It's for them. And we can say with respect to the community of the universe, to have a mind is already, at least in principle, to be community-minded. What our last end, our happiness, truly consists in just is our best share in the universal common good. That's his view. These natural determinations of the mind are our first movements toward it, toward that share. We don't have free choice about having those determinations or not, but they are exquisitely suited to us as free beings for our own sake. So now finally, let me just bring in one last concept or idea. The place where Aristotle characterizes freedom as being for one's own sake is Book 1 of the Metaphysics. His topic there is wisdom. That's the other concept, wisdom. He's explaining how wisdom compares with other kinds of knowledge. 4 features of wisdom stand out here, and I want to mention them. He says one thing is that it is not practical knowledge. It's not sought as a means to action. It is theoretical. Wisdom is theoretical, which is to say contemplative, for the sheer enjoyment of the knowledge itself. We might say that it is sought by the people who love the life of the mind. A second feature of wisdom is that it is the most authoritative kind of knowledge. It orders or directs all the other kinds. That's because it gives the account of the very first principles and causes on which all other knowledge depends. Third, wisdom is pursued, this is the connection with what came before, it's pursued as the only free knowledge. It alone, Aristotle says, is simply for its own sake, like a free man. It alone is simply free, wisdom. And this leads him directly to the fourth feature of wisdom. It is something divine, he says. And it's so in 2 ways. One is that it treats of divine things. For he says, the God is a first principle, cause of all things. In fact, the God is the first final cause of all things, which is to say, their last end. God is quote, the supreme good of the whole of nature. That's Aristotle. The primary common good of the universe. And so he, most of all, is for his own sake. And secondly, wisdom is divine, also because the God possesses it. The divine mind enjoys wisdom to the highest degree. And yet Aristotle insists human beings, slavish as they may seem to be, can aspire to some share in wisdom. The God is not jealous, he says. Now, this human's share in wisdom would evidently be the very science of metaphysics. At least that's how Aquinas takes it. And he very much agrees with Aristotle's characterization of it. It's theoretical, authoritative, free, and divine metaphysics. It's the highest knowledge to which the human mind, according to its natural endowment, that is, the human mind as human, can aspire. Now, Thomas also holds that the habit of wisdom is the very noblest of human virtues. He fully agrees with Aristotle that the practice of wisdom, we can call it sapiential contemplation, is the best, most desirable activity in which human beings can engage. If it is not the entirety of full human happiness, it is at least the chief factor in it. Of course, Thomas personally also just preferred it himself, you know. You may have heard that story when he was traveling to Paris with some companions. They reached a hill from which you could sort of see the whole panorama of the city of Paris and its glory, you know. And one of his companions turned to him and he said, "Wouldn't it be wonderful to be the Lord of all that?" And Thomas said, "Well, yeah, I guess. But I would really rather have that commentary by John Chrysostom on the Gospel of Matthew." Right? He really was not interested in the practical life at all. But this is not just a personal choice of his. He thinks that it really is the best contemplation. But we should be clear about why this is so. In particular, we should be clear about why the best activity is contemplative or theoretical and not practical. It's not just that wisdom frames principles for practical thought and thereby directs it. That's quite true for Thomas. He assigns to metaphysics the task of determining the very highest practical principle, which is precisely the ultimate end of human life. Practical thought for him does not decide what the end is. It takes the end for granted. Its job is to command the movement toward the end. However, to say that wisdom identifies the end is not by itself to say that its own activity, sapiential contemplation, itself is the attainment of the end. The attainment of the last end, happiness, could still chiefly consist in practical activity. It all depends on what the end is. In a remarkable passage along this line, Thomas asks whether happiness does not pertain more to practical thought than to theoretical. After all, practical thought is about human things, and happiness itself is a human thing. So it seems practical. By contrast, theoretical thinking has more to do with things extrinsic to man. That's the argument. Thomas replies to that in this way. He says, if man were his own last end, then considering and ordering his actions and passions, which is to say practical thinking, would be his happiness. But the last end of man is a certain extrinsic good, namely God, whom we attain in an activity of theoretical intellect. In other words, if there were no God, or if our mind could not reach him, then theoretical activity would not be absolutely supreme. The life of the mind would not be the simply best life. It might define the goal, but it would not itself hit the goal. Hitting the goal would be practical. I think the goal would still be a common good, but a purely human one. ultimately, in that case, science and philosophy would serve politics. And wisdom would not be entirely free. But in fact, obviously for Thomas, there is a higher than human goal. We are happiest in focusing not on ourselves or even on happiness itself, but on happiness as object. And only wisdom attains that in knowing it. Now, St. Thomas thinks he finds even that view in Aristotle. That is the reason why wisdom is the highest, is that it has to do with the divine. However, Thomas also has thoughts on this topic that he does not get from Aristotle. He has something that he doesn't get from Aristotle, after all. In one place, and I'll finish with this thought, in one place Thomas asks whether the contemplative life is a purely cognitive or intellectual affair. He says it's not, because it is a freely chosen activity. It is moved by some affection, some love, but not always the same love. In some cases, he says, the motive is self-love. Some people choose to contemplate, and even to contemplate the best things, simply because that is their own most fulfilling activity. But others, he says, choose to contemplate out of love of the one contemplated, that is, out of love of God. And this, he says, is the contemplative life of saints, those who engage in holy thinking. They dwell on God chiefly in order to glorify and serve Him, more for His sake than for their own. And of course, one might then ask, well, are they therefore less free? It's less for their own sake. I think Thomas would deny that they're less free. For again, where your treasure is, there is your heart also. In serving the one they love, the saints are entirely at home. And what that means for Thomas is that they live with the freedom of the children of God. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Brock. I think that given that we've only got about 10 minutes, it would be good to move straight into questions. What will happen is this. We are actually live streaming this so that people can watch and listen who aren't in the room with us. For that reason, when you ask a question, you should speak into the microphone, because otherwise, even if we hear you, they won't. So there's that. And then as you raise your hands, what I'm going to do is just give you a number, and we'll just go through the numbers. There will probably be more questions than there's time. And you may have to just follow us up to the reception afterward to get your question in. Okay.
Aren't you going to answer them?
No, you
Oh,
were
so I was sorry.
gonna answer.
Oh, sorry.
I'll take him. He'll answer. Questions, comments? One.
I have. Can you hear me? I have two questions, but I'll just start with one. Something that strikes me is this sounds very persuasive and lovely if you like thinking, but if you are a practical person, how does this move you or attract you? And are we supposed to walk up to everyone in our life who's really good at politics and really likes engaging with action and change and say, you need to contemplate, right? God obviously made people with different strengths. I mean, and I grew up with a bunch of book readers, so I think about this a lot. What do I say to them? Is my way of life better or?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's the question that comes up, certainly. Yeah. And I suppose the full answer for Thomas would be rather long. He certainly is aware that people have different dispositions and aptitudes and tastes and live under very different conditions, right? I think maybe the point would be that he thinks that, as I said before, there's not just many ways to happiness. Happiness comes even in many forms, right? There are many happinesses. Some of them are false, right? Like the life of the sensualist. That's a false happiness. It's a kind of happiness, but it's false. It doesn't really, right? He thinks, though, that the practical life is a true form of happiness, right? Because it really is living according to the mind, right? He also thinks that even the most practical person needs some contemplative dimension. They need that. They need to draw upon wisdom. Maybe they don't devote themselves entirely to that, but they need to draw on it. It's like a lot of things in Thomas. He doesn't feel that he needs to denigrate one thing in order to exalt another. You know, he does finally think the contemplative life is higher, but that's not at all to detract from the importance and the beauty of the practical life and the value of that. And for him, it's only in the case of God does one live both perfectly. God also has his practical side for Thomas, and the practical person too imitates God, right? And the contemplative person can't do the practical things also. He can't be both, right? So the practical person, again, has something that contributes something to human life that the contemplative doesn't. That's at least part of the answer, I think. Okay.
Thank you so much. I wanted to follow up on that first question. So Aristotle lived in a world that did not know of Christianity.
Sure.
And his God was a impersonal God who was not trying in any way to be in relationship to us. And one sees, in Aquinas, this tremendous effort to bring Aristotle into a Christian worldview. But if one is if one's in Aristotle's thought world, it would be very hard to see what practical, why practical life would be aimed at more than the political life or the best human form of life.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And thus contemplation would be, you can see why contemplation would be for him the superior life. If you're, this is really a question, and you know this, understand this so much better than I do. But if I look at what I think of as Jesus' teachings when I read him, he doesn't seem to me to be sort of recommending the contemplative life. He seems to be recommending a practical life, but a practical life that could be oriented differently than in possibilities than one that was available to Aristotle. In that you don't.
Sure.
Although the practical is essentially human in the sense that I have to do it or we have to do it, it's not essentially human in the sense that it's got to be directed towards the human. And I just wondered what you thought about that, or whether whether this makes, what you think of that. I mean.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's certainly true that in Christianity there's the practical life has possibilities and goals and value that goes beyond the political, and I think it's probably true that Aristotle, you don't see that in Aristotle. I think also the contemplative life does, and I think Thomas would want to stress that. And I think it's important for him that love, Christian love, is not purely practical. He understands charity to be friendship with God. That's how he defines charity. It's primarily friendship with God, and then friendship with God's friends also. And the contemplative life would be just, above all, contemplating the friend. As a person in love contemplates the one. That's contemplative for him. Now that's very personal. It's not the God who's at a distance. It's not metaphysics. I was focusing on metaphysics here because this, after all, is a philosophy lecture, right? But theological contemplation and then prayer for Thomas, are much higher. Philosophy is just a tool for that, ultimately, right? And this, of course, Aristotle, the personal interaction. But if you think of it in contemplation in those terms, as going beyond just philosophical speculation, but also a personal relationship with God, then I think we do find in the gospel the most famous one, of course, is the scene of Martha and Mary. Martha is very practical. She's preparing dinner, she's washing the dishes, and she's getting nervous, and Mary is just sitting at Jesus' feet. And Jesus says, well, she's chosen the better part. She's just listening to me and looking at me and taking it in. And that's better. He says that's better, right? That's higher, you know. And he himself, the example that he gives, he's kind of busy those 3 years of his public life, you know, but so he's doing a lot of things, but he spends so many hours alone in prayer, all night long sometimes, hours and hours and hours, and he's giving that example, right? So I think I would say that both open up both possibilities are opened up, and there's a further factor, which for Tom would be that the choice of one or another depends now on ultimately on what you perceive to be God's own will, and he may ask you to sacrifice the contemplative to the practical, even if you prefer the contemplative in this life for his own purposes, because the ultimate contemplation is reserved for the next life, right? And that's the beatific vision, right? Of course, yeah. Okay. Sorry, that was a long answer, but.
Well, I think this will follow in the same vein of each of the last two in some way. I mean, you mentioned that for Thomas, there's clearly a dimension in which wisdom, contemplation, does transcend politics. But is there a role for it to do something in the city, or does it affect practical judgment in some way, or is wisdom only reserved towards selecting the end and can't actually guide prudence in any way?
Well, selecting the end is not nothing, you know. That's that's a pretty major factor.
Is the contemplative expected to be good? Is one way of putting it.
The contemplative person.
Yes.
Well, of course, he's still a citizen. For Thomas, he is certainly a citizen. And he would certainly have the duty. I think Thomas thinks that everyone in the city, whether or not they're contemplative persons or not, they need some share in wisdom, some share in the fruits of wisdom, right? And it would be the duty of the one who dedicates himself to wisdom to teach that. Teaching, I think, that's a pretty political sort of thing, you know. It has a political dimension, and Thomas himself dedicated himself to that. And the very ordering of human life, I think, you know, and this is connected with the other one too, the importance of the Sabbath, you know, when you're freed from the necessity of labor so that you can, vacare in divinis, you can rest in the contemplation of divine. He thinks everybody needs that, right? And again, the guide, the master of that, the teacher of that would be the wise person. So I think it has a very important role in the political life, yeah.
Thank you. I took it that you were saying that that God is the last end of a human being and the full good of a human being, which is perceived only by the contemplative mind, not by practical things, but by the contemplative things. The choice to contemplate is a practical choice, right. But otherwise, it basically. One could do away, once one has decided to contemplate, you could do away with all practical things and still achieve the ultimate good. You could still achieve a completely full human life, in Aquinas' view. Is that accurate, or would he say, no, you still do need to eat? Humans need to eat regardless of whether they're contemplating God.
Sure. Yeah, maybe here it's interesting to distinguish, but he thinks that we can talk about the ultimate end of human life in two ways. We can talk about the ultimate end, which is proportioned to human nature and is attainable in the life that we live now, right? And that is the primary factor in that is contemplation, but it's not the only thing. It's the main thing. It's by no means. You still need to eat. You still need to take. You still need to have friends. You need And practical things are very important. You need to cultivate all the virtues. We need all the virtues and the activities of all the virtues for a complete human life, right? With wisdom sort of at the top, right? But then he thinks that this happiness and this satisfaction are ordered to a further one by the grace of God, and we know this by revelation. And it's not attainable in this life. And that's heaven, the ultimate happiness. And he thinks that the essence of that happiness is entirely contemplative, because it consists in what he calls the contemplation of the vision of God. And it's kind of a real union with the divine nature, with God himself. And that contains everything you need, right? That has it all, right? And it's not kind of just thinking about God. It's kind of being really just face to face with him. And you can't even imagine it, obviously, right? That doesn't mean that he thinks that we won't be doing anything in heaven but that. I don't think it means that. You can be doing lots of other things, but the essence of happiness is just, that would be enough, right? It would be enough. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we should probably close off and move up to the reception, which is in Stewart Hall 216. There will be many people walking in that direction, so it will be relatively easy to find. Join me in thanking Professor Brock.
Thank you.